The question I want to speak to is, what is the spirituality we need? It's a little different of a reframe, but it helped organize my thoughts in this, around this question. So to address the question, I'm going to define spirituality as a set of ontological, epistemological, axiological, and metaphysical commitments. So there's 4 commitments that I think are part of any spirituality. Now, these commitments can be conscious or unconscious, conditioned or well thought out, linguistic, symbolic, or embodied and enacted, perspectival and theoretic, or aperspectival and pre-reflective. So, for example, I might have an ontological commitment to the reality of the world and not know I do, but the way I behave, like in traffic, I jump away from the car. So they don't necessarily have to be conceptually conceived commitments, but I'm describing the spirituality as a set of commitments. So then to ask what is the spirituality we need is to ask what is the set of ontological, epistemological, axiological, and metaphysical commitments we need today. Now, the first thing I want to say is that we need a coherent set of commitments. We're sorely lacking a coherent set of commitments, especially when, for example, science and postmodernism started and religion became 3 kind of silos. So today people hold contradictory or incompatible commitments, which makes for either a partial or a fragmented spirituality. And it's in fact the reason why we think spirituality is one domain, science is another domain, religion might be a different domain, postmodern structuralism might be another domain. And what I'm saying is that if you define spirituality as a set of these commitments, then the domain of spirituality can hold all of them. But this is tricky. For example, Roy Bhaskar showed that epistemological relativism in the postmodern world is actually more coherent when combined with ontological realism, which the postmodern world thought it would just exit. But I agree with him. I think the spirituality we need must entail epistemological relativism, but I think it also must commit to ontological realism. Ontological realism is a commitment that there is an intransitive world that doesn't depend upon human knowledge or experience of it. It is a commitment to the possibility of realities that are unknown and unknowable, but still very real in the sense of actually existing. One could say ontological realism is a commitment that our bodies make, regardless of our philosophical ideas. So we might have the idea that the world is an illusion or have some kind of philosophical idealism, but what our bodies do seem basically to be committed to ontological realism. Epistemological relativism is a commitment to both the partiality of what we can know, but also to the contextuality of its validity. So this is an important add-on, I think, to the discourse around epistemological relativism. We know that all truths are both partial and valid, but what I want to say is that all valid truths are fully valid within their partial context. There's no error inside that context. The purpose of philosophy then is to identify the context that validates the truth, to become intimate and empathic, and be able to see from that context, and to expand the context in which new truths can be discovered. Epistemological relativism is a commitment to the potential infinite disclosure of reality by creating and newly enacting contexts, which we might call, for example, paradigms. In terms of axiological commitments, I'll go back to Bhaskar. He used the notion of judgmental rationalism as its foundation. However, I think the spirituality we need must be able to deal with the incommensurability of values and worldviews, hence the impossibility of adjudicating them as Bhaskar might have proposed. So I think the notion of judgmental is too coarse-grained. Instead, I use the word evaluative. Secondly, I think the notion of rationalism is too fixed in the modern Enlightenment. We need to invite other types of post-formal or trans-rational modes of reasoning. So together, this leads to what I call the practice of evaluative reasoning, which is both an ethical and an aesthetic capacity. It is more like the principle of discernment, which depends upon both sensitivity and clarity. Evaluative reasoning is a commitment to values that are reasonable. This is not a notion that is limited to anthropocentric modes of evaluative reasoning. We might ask, what is reasonable for a forest? A question that might be addressed through post-formal or trans-rational modes of participatory relational inquiry. This greatly expands Bhaska's notion for the spirituality we need today. So those are the first three of the four commitments: ontological realism, epistemic relativism, and evaluative reasonableness. This brings us to the question of what kind of metaphysical commitment would be part of the spirituality we need. Okay, there are two parts to this question. The first part involves a commitment to a certain cosmological story that functions as the background or primary framing of our reality. It is our commitment to what is, or what is the case. Every spirituality has an explicit cosmological story, and it is in this sense that science too can be regarded as part of the spiritual project. My approach is to derive the most minimal set of metaphysical conditions that serve as generator functions of everything else. This would be able to anchor multiple cosmological stories in a common metaphysical ground. So what are the minimum set of generator functions for the cosmos to exist with features such as plurality, understanding, consciousness, subjective experience, thought, desire, as well as stars and supernova, magnetic fields, plants and life forms, and that someone like me is speaking to you through technology to someone like you? A cosmological story answers the question, how is it that we are who we are, where we are, as we are? So a minimal metaphysics needs only three conditions to generate all of what is. First, there is some kind of process that happens or can happen, either as a field or a fluctuation of energy. This is axiomatic. We have to start somewhere. It is possible that universes come and go through fluctuations that do not persist to the second and third conditions. But if that was only the case, we wouldn't have the awareness and the experience in the world we do have. So, second, the process must be self-differentiating. Another way to say this is that the process field must be asymmetric. It may be the case that there are universes where the process field exists without differentiation. It would not be able to know itself or to generate the world we see, or consciousness itself. Thirdly, the self-differentiated aspects or asymmetric aspects must be able to participate. It is possible to conceive of the asymmetry itself as generating the participation, but it is also possible to think of universes where all there is kinds of stuff, but without participation, the stuff would never be aware. There would be no communication, no relational dynamics, no flows of energy, no flows. So those are our minimal condition. Everything else is story. So we can ask, what kind of story does the spirituality we need? So what kind of story are we going to build on the minimum metaphysical conditions? The minimum metaphysical conditions being that there's some kind of process, it self-differentiates, and the self-differentiating parts participate. So now we can have multiple stories placed on top of that foundation. But what I'm going to suggest is that the story we create today, what we need, must satisfy four conditions. I call them the 4 A's. So the first one is appealing. The story must appeal to our deepest spiritual intuitions. So appealing. The story must appeal to our deepest spiritual intuitions. It has to be tied into the implicit, intimate intuitions we have that we call spiritual experience. 2, available. The story must be available to scientific inquiry. This does not mean it has to have causal evidence. It needs to be available to scientific inquiry. 3, actionable. The story must have actionable impact in the world. This is very, very critical for the spirituality we need today. I think it's obvious. And 4, aesthetic. And I write this with an AE. That means both aesthetics, like in art, and ethics. The story must be good and beautiful. So with these 3 generator functions and the 4 conditions, we have the metaphysical framework for our cosmology. That is the first metaphysical commitment. But there's a second metaphysical commitment, and it involves the metaphysics of experience. It addresses who we are in relation to the great cosmological story. It explains our awareness, affects, sensations, perceptions, body processes, and sensory motor actions, our thoughts, memories, and the psychological structures that give rise to experiences of self, other, and world. It is a commitment to the phenomenon of subjectivity, the nature of the self in all its structures, its perspectival nature, and its intersubjective nature. It is a commitment to the life force as deeply purposive and meaningful. We see that experience is the cosmological process at micro scale, that its experience itself is self-differentiating participation, that awareness is a fluctuating field of energy moments in a vast expanse of space. I think we must commit to a process metaphysics of experience for the spirituality we need today. This has the potential to transform the architecture of thought and the paradigms of our scientific and humanistic theories. We are, for example, deeply addicted to the principle of progressive advance, where the past is seen as primitive and all the goods are ahead of us in the future. This leads us to behaviors such like we are willing to destroy the village in order to modernize it. We are willing to destroy the planet in order to escape it. We are willing to turn our sensitive organic bodies over to the machines in order to make faster computations. That's because the village, the planet, our bodies are anchored deeply in the past, and we've come to think of potentials as eagerly awaiting us in the future. This is what Whitehead would call misplaced concreteness. The future is not somehow up there waiting for us like the proverbial God waiting to welcome us home, or the paycheck that comes only after the work is done, or the enlightened self we hope to realize. In this kind of progressive spirituality, everything must be sacrificed for something else. This is the great Christian tragedy, the story of Christ, why God had to die to put an end to the future, to put an end for waiting for the Messiah. As he died, Christ said, "It is finished." Every moment is a completion of all past moments, and the perishing of this moment sets the very possibility of the next. This is not progressive advance. It is, as Hartshorne put it, creative synthesis. We are not something that happens after the animals evolved. We are the animals evolving. We are the planetary and cosmological processes of self-differentiating potential, which actualizes itself through participation. The spirituality we need is not one of self-fulfilling prophecies. It is one of self-unfolding fulfillment. We have inherited everything that has come before. It is given freely to us, and there is no debt to pay. This relationship that spirituality has with the past, with the ever-increasing debt we must pay for our sins, must come to an end. It has a strange affinity with the logics of capitalism, which also must come to an end. We must be finished with this notion of ever-progressive future, of going somewhere special, because in the process we destroy everything that has come before, the generative ground of our becoming. From the seed, everything expands in all directions. time, like space, is omnidirectional. The future is in the present in the same way that today we can look back on yesterday. Consider the view of the known universe derived from logarithmic maps by a team of Princeton researchers and NASA. You are the center of a giant eyeball, and everywhere you look is the past. The question is, where is tomorrow? Committing to a process metaphysics would completely disrupt our spiritual, philosophical, and scientific understanding. For example, if we were to imagine 3 glasses of water as a metaphor of reality, you and I would both agree that the glasses represent the structural features and the water represents the process. Yet you will most likely have an image of 3 glasses of water on a table, whereas the process philosopher imagines 3 glasses submerged in a tub of water. The difference here is that the modern people starts from a metaphysics of separation. We could read the history of philosophy, science, and spirituality as attempts to answer, how can things touch? In philosophy, we have transcendentalism. In science, we have background radiation, plasma, and quantum entanglement. In spirituality, we have souls, transpersonal psyches, and storehouse consciousness. A process metaphysics avoids that first move by conceiving of existence as touching what Whitehead called prehension. The notion of existence as becoming into relationship, as successfully being relationship, and as potential relationships that subsist in between these moments is the metaphysical ground of a spirituality of interbeing. Starting from interbeing, there would be no longer a need for people to try to unify under a single religion or adjudicate incommensurable values. Starting from interbeing, we would be responsible to and respectful of the living earth and her cosmological family. Starting from interbeing, spirituality would be the experience of having been included in the great mystery of the universal unfolding, and a gift so enormous it can only be faced by spiritual wonder and an overwhelming sense of gratitude and reverence. We are given this world, its incredible beauty, complexity, richness, and abundance, and it could have been otherwise. And it might one day be otherwise. The spirituality we need must embrace both the precarity and the preciousness of existence. In summary, my response is framed by the question, what is the spirituality we need today? My answer is that we need a spirituality that has a set of commitments, a commitment to process metaphysics and process cosmology and process experience, a commitment to evaluative reasonableness, a commitment to epistemological relativism, and a commitment to ontological realism. And that offers a story or stories that satisfy 4 conditions. The stories must appeal to our deepest spiritual intuitions. The stories must be available to scientific inquiry. The stories must have actionable impact in the world. And the stories must be good and beautiful. And I hope that they are stories that express interbeing and come from a deep experience of mystery, gratitude, and reverence.